Last week, we started our investigation of this classic dilemma, both in America's religious history and in Christian history, that dilemma between resisting culture and accommodating culture. And we started by looking at the Puritans, and I was suggesting that the Puritans intentionally tried to create themselves as a distinct culture, even to the point of literally cultivating a new identity, a new sense of purpose, so that they could be God's people. They were not, I suggested, escapists. They were not fleeing from a situation that they thought was beyond their control. They were, in coming in 1630 to the founding of New England, intentionally trying to create this society that was a living model of a Bible commonwealth, a way of living out in a practical, concrete way their religious commitment, to show that there are other ways for Christians to be disciples rather than just embracing the historical Constantinian fusion where the church follows along whatever the state wants to do. And I suggested that one of the best examples of that is John Winthrop, the governor who leads that first wave of the errand over in 1630 when he, on board his flagship, the Arbella, gave the model of Christian charity speech. And I tried to give a brief thumbnail sketch. And as I thought about it over the course of the week, I was making it more difficult than it had to be. Because really what he's doing is he's saying to the Puritan people, we are going to live out, literally, the Sermon on the Mount. That the Sermon on the Mount is, in essence, a kind of constitution for these peculiar disciples and the way that they ought to live. And so as you go through that speech he gives, he's really following the Sermon on the Mount and saying, it's not going to be nice wishful thinking. It's going to be our constitution for living as God's people in this place, and in particular for England. And toward that end, John Winthrop and the New England Puritans created these voluntary, covenanted congregations, covenants with each other, to live by this sort of rigorous ideal, the Christian discipleship, the Christian walk, to maintain the Puritans' counterculture. Now, when I talk about covenanting, it's more than just, well, I'll do it if you do it. They really put some effort into this, folks. They created what was called visible saint status. That you could be a kind of member of the church, but if you really wanted to be a covenanted part of this congregation, you worked through a series of tests, if you will. At one point, I counted 15 different tests that one would take. Everything from Bible knowledge tests to people actually standing up in front of the congregation and vouching for you, saying, yeah, this person really is trying to live the Christ-like life. 15 different steps. And if you got tripped up in any one of those, well, then you might be able to attend, but you wouldn't be a full, visible member. Now, what went with full, visible membership was things like the sacraments. And the two sacraments that the Puritans would practice were baptism and the Lord's Supper. So if you weren't a full, visible saint in one of these covenanted congregations, then you really didn't have access. They practiced what was called closed communion. You also didn't get voting rights in the Puritan community. So it meant something. Now, they weren't saying with this that if you failed to achieve visible saint status, you were somehow or another not saved. It wasn't a salvation issue. What they were trying to say was, we think these people who pass these series of tests really are one of the few, the proud, the Puritans. And that we will hold each other accountable to that. We will check on you and you will check on us. And we can then live out for the world to see this city on a hill, this model for Christian living that other people ought to follow and embrace. So, they committed themselves to this. And membership, if you managed to work your way through there, non-transferable. You couldn't say, well, I'm not sure I like this congregation anymore. There's another one a few miles down the road. I think I'll just pick up my visible saint membership and move it down there. If you moved your membership, you had to start back at the beginning and go through the whole process again. So it was devout and rigorous. It was, the term the Puritans would use, scrupulous. And they were not apologetic about that. They wanted to be that because that is what they believed God called them to be, the model. But that could be a little off-putting, couldn't it? Before you could be a full member of a congregation, you go before the congregation and they say, great, we're going to put you through 15 tests. And that could take maybe a year before we decide whether you're going to get visible saint status. Well, a lot of people, upon hearing that, would say, not sure that's for me. I think I'll just let you all handle that if that's the way you want to be. So for our investigation in this classic dilemma, the example of the Puritans raises the question, are we called to be so peculiar? If we strive for such distinction or distinctiveness, will we not lose somehow or another the ability to relate to the lost? Will we not alienate them? Will they not be estranged by our level of scrupulosity? And if we are that odd, will we not then ultimately fail in the Great Commission? So how do we balance these two great good? To phrase it another way, people started asking, wait a second, if we are supposed to be the leaven, don't we have to be in the recipe? Or if we are going to provide a bridge, don't we have to connect to something, somebody, somewhere? If we're so distant from it, don't we lose our objective? Or to use even another metaphor, if you're going to speak to the lost world, don't you have to use a language that they understand, the language they communicate with? And isn't that even biblical? Jeremiah chapter 29, the people of Israel are taken into captivity. And Jeremiah says in verse 5, chapter 29, build houses, take wives, seek the welfare of the city that I have sent you into exile, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. In other words, get in that culture. You can only impact that culture by being part of it. Or 1 Corinthians chapter 9, what does the Apostle Paul say? To the Jews I became a Jew, and to those outside the law I became as one outside the law. Why? That I might save some. So he was kind of adjusting. He wasn't being so distinct that he couldn't relate to everybody. Think about the difference between Jesus and John the Baptist. John the Baptist was out there in the wilderness, and Jesus was frequently in there where the people were, speaking their language at that moment. So the Puritans illustrate that sometimes the scrupulosity required to maintain their distinct or peculiar identity got a little hard to sell, and it could alienate people. Frequently, it would lead to emphases on theological codification, if you will, creedal definitions. We got to make sure we have that T crossed, that I dotted, just so, or it's not. It might be heresy. Well, where was the vital piety? Where did it go in that? And how do you enforce without killing the spirit, killing the community in the process? And how do you encourage and demand something from individual members without crushing their individuality in the process? So by the 18th century, after the Puritan experiment had run its course for a little while, the Puritan movement had in fact declined in New England. It was hard to sustain. That's not unusual or exceptional that in New England religion had kind of declined. Because even though 10 of the 13 colonies founded by English citizens in North America had religion at the heart of their charter, by the time you get into the 18th century, British colonial North America is not a particularly devout place. Now, I don't want to leave the wrong impression. I don't want to suggest that somehow or another colonial America was just pagan. It wasn't. People were still generally Christian in their orientation, their ethos. But church attendance had really dropped. Some estimates have church membership, church participation in the 18th century at somewhere between 10 and 15%. Exceptionally low. There just wasn't a lot of formal expressions of Christian faith. And it's at that low point in the 18th century that some people started wanting to rehabilitate the usefulness of Christianity in American life. They found some help, because this wasn't even exceptional to America. The Western world had in some ways sort of dipped in the 18th century. And some Americans found in a German theologian, a guy named Philip Spener, an idea, an emphasis that could help potentially rehabilitate the spirit, the fervor of religion in America. You see, Spener had come to the conclusion that religious orthodoxy led to one of two polar extremes. That on the one hand, people who were all uptight about crossing those T's and dotting those theological I's, they made religion kind of, I don't know, just irrelevant to daily life, led to a kind of apathy. Is that all there is? Just arguing over the Monophysite heresy or something? You know, who gets really inspired about that anymore? You know? Or, Spener said, if it didn't lead to apathy, it led to a sort of hyper-religiosity, where all of life was, in fact, caught up in making sure that T was crossed or that I was dotted. And so what he said, Spener said, was we got to get back to what really puts vitality into piety. So we can do that by, first of all, re-embracing the sense of conversion. That Christianity is a principled decision, oftentimes. That there is a moment of new birth, that something has to change in life. And we ought to know that, and we ought to celebrate that. That moment marks a profound metanoia, the conversion in life. Something is different. In addition, he said, to emphasizing the new birth, we really ought to celebrate our devotional life. We ought to find ways to put ourselves into it. And so he created or encouraged the formation of small groups. He called them collegia pietatis. Small groups emphasizing piety. Again, sort of accountability groups, Bible study groups, places where you could go and bare your soul. Careful, thoughtful, intentional. Now that sounds a bit like Puritanism, but what is distinctive about his message was his emphasis on the heart. Truth was often found in a sense of feeling. It was the affections that got involved. True knowledge is effective knowledge, Spener argued. He said, quote, "There's just simply a difference between knowing honey is sweet and having the sensation." Now that's important. How do you know something's sweet? Can you really explain the sensation of sweetness? Or is it something you just have to feel? And he said that's Christianity. You can rationally pull out a creed or a theology and explain it, but it's got to be something deeper than that. And that's what he wanted to stress. That also fit the 18th century in some ways, because the 18th century was a time when people were beginning to celebrate the distinctive, unique nature of an individual. And that plugged in very nicely. And the revivals that started emerging were the vehicle for delivering this message. The vehicle for selling and communicating the pietist message. And so the the people who started saying, let's hold a revival where we have the feeling, where we express the feeling, became known as New Lights. People who promoted revivals. And you can imagine on the other side, people who didn't like revivals were called Old Lights. So you had this sort of tension between pro-revivalist New Lights and the anti-revivalist Old Lights. And the New Lights were carrying the day because they had a message that connected with the 18th century American. And the individual who really sold it was a guy from England nicknamed the Grand Itinerant George Whitefield. Now, you may not have heard of George Whitefield. I'm sure some of you have. Historian Timothy Breen up at Northwestern University once described George Whitefield as the most important man of 18th century America. And you start thinking, who else could contest for that title? 18th century America? Well, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, James Madison, George Whitefield? I'm not sure I've even heard of this guy. Who's he? And how did he get to be such an important character? Well, Breen says he really is America's first hero. He is the first individual that almost all Americans sort of knew by name. It didn't start out that way. George Whitefield was born in England, very humble beginnings. His mother ran an inn, and he had to help her serve the guests. But he had a little flair for the dramatic and had a lot of ambition. And one night, an individual spending the night at the inn sort of sensed this in George and said, tell you what, I'm going to give you a chance to develop yourself. I'm going to get you into Oxford University. Talk about a break. A kid who's sort of from humble beginnings getting a chance to go to Oxford. Great! He gets to Oxford only to find out that in addition to going to class, he has to serve his fellow students because rank was not academic rank at that time, it was social rank. And so yes, he got to go there, but part of his task was to serve the meals to the rich kids. He didn't put together, George Whitefield didn't, a really great, inspiring transcript. It was okay, he managed to get through, but he wasn't top of the class by any stretch of the imagination. But what he did find were two brothers, John and Charles Wesley. And the three of them put together what becomes known as the Oxford Holy Club. And here they started sharing their experiences, their desires, their commitment to the pietist movement. They became dubbed, or were dubbed, enthusiasts. Now, in our day and time, it's all right for somebody to be an enthusiast, to be enthusiastic about somebody. But in 18th century England, to be an enthusiast was kind of common of disdain. You're a little carried away. You lack decorum or something. But he was saying, I can't help it. And when he got in the pulpit to preach, he got enthusiastic. And so a lot of the Anglican churches closed their doors to him. He said, fine, I'll go out in the field across the street and we'll preach out there. And anybody who wants to come, you come and we will celebrate the gospel because it is something to, in fact, celebrate. Well, the Anglican officials were a little troubled by this. They didn't know how to manage a guy with that much emotion and passion. So they said, great, we'll take care of him. 1738, they sent him to Georgia, the colony of Georgia. Said, there's an orphan's home over there. Go run it for a while. Thought that would cool his heels. What he realized when he got over here was that America was a lot like over there. That the state of religion was flat. And that Americans needed reviving too. And as he was making his way back and forth from time to time, he started asking himself the question, why is it that we've got such a great, grand message and people don't want to hear it? Then he asked the next question, where do people want to go? When they have leisure time, where do they choose to go? Where will they even spend money to go? And in his day, 18th century society? The answer was the theater. And so he decided, I'm going to the theater and see what they got that we don't in the church. And he was struck by the ability of an actor named David Garrow, a great Shakespearean actor. And he said, I can do that. Not acting, but I can bring that same kind of energy into the church, and maybe that will then bring the people into the church. And so he adjusted his entire preaching style. The tradition was to write out your sermon as a manuscript and stand there very still and dignified and read your sermon and then look up, read the sermon, look up. He said, they don't do that in a theater. They memorize their lines. So he memorized his sermons to make him able to connect to the people. And he said, don't use those old, boring topics for sermons. Like the Monophysite heresy, for example. Who wants to go to church to hear a sermon about the Monophysite heresy? They want to hear stories. And the Bible's full of good stories. The parables, the Old Testament. Pull those out. That's what people want to hear. Avoid, he said, the New Testament epistles. And then he said, be novel. In addition to being dramatic, be novel. Maybe even a little, dare we say, scandalous? Because if something's going on and it's creating a hubbub, people are going to go here. They're going to go see. Even better yet, the newspapers may show up and report it. And then you're getting free publicity. So it's a way of creating an environment that could draw. And they did. A few people got a little carried away with this, by the way. One of the New Light revivalists actually got into book burnings. So the scandalous part could get a little carried away. But Whitefield kept it pretty much on track. In addition, he said, keep it, well, like any good actor, always leave them wanting more. So he'd come into town. He'd stay in town maybe a day or two. In a region, maybe a month. But always leave them wanting more and asking you to come back. And so he was adapting to what the 18th century market wanted. As historian Frank Lambert has recently pointed out, if you think about it, the first Great Awakening, the series of revivals associated primarily with the grand itinerant George Whitefield, was really invented, contrived, created. You have the New Lights as a group of religious entrepreneurs. They did their market research. They found out why people weren't going to church. They found out what might get them into church, and they did it. And did it work? You bet it worked. Whitefield, over the course of his life, delivered 15,000 sermons. 15,000 sermons. The demand was so great to hear him preach. He couldn't keep up with the demand. In his 45-day New England tour, 45 days, he gave 175 sermons. Talk about keeping busy. But people were crushing. And what are you supposed to do? Say, sorry, I'm tired, I can't share the good news with you right now. You know, he had to do it. He was called to do it. And there are all these wonderful stories about his power, his ability. One of the sort of popular legends was that he could get up before a crowd of people and say the word Mesopotamia, and people would start weeping because it was said so beautifully. I used to do early Western Civ, and when I said Mesopotamia, students wept, but it wasn't because I was saying it beautifully. They're like, oh no. One lady, when interviewed about what she thought of the grand itinerant, said, he's the most wonderful preacher I've ever heard. Now what's ironic about that was she just got off the boat from Germany and didn't understand English. She had no earthly idea what he had said, but he was a great preacher. Best preacher she had ever heard. Not sure what he said, but the ability to communicate even through the language barrier. Benjamin Franklin. Now again, think of the individual who's giving us the report. This is a guy who's not a big fan of formal Orthodox Christianity. He went to one of these revivals when George Whitefield spoke at the Commons there in Boston. Benjamin Franklin said, I estimated the crowd at 32,000 people. 32,000 people show up to hear Whitefield speak. Now, to put that in comparison, the city of Boston only had a population of 16,000. So they were literally, anytime people heard that Whitefield was in the region, they would drop whatever they were doing because they wanted to hear what this guy had to offer. It was so profound. And according to Benjamin Franklin, he could also talk you out of your money. He frequently would pass the hat at the end of the sermon for this orphanage that he had committed himself to. And even Benjamin Franklin said, I would first say, well, I'd give him my small change, and then I'd give him my small bills, and before long I dumped my entire wallet into the collection plate. So from that point on, he made sure to leave most of his money at home before he went. Because even though he knew it was coming, Whitefield could talk him out of it. I don't know if I have time to get all this in, but I got to tell you this story. Whitefield would later die in New England. And he was buried in a little place called Newburyport, New Hampshire. And this sort of captivation with Whitefield continued even after he died. People had to go to the place where Whitefield was buried. And then he was actually buried under the pulpit in a special chamber in the church building. And the church, because of the crush of the masses coming, said, we'll take you downstairs. You can see the coffin. Well, then people didn't want to just go down and see the coffin. They wanted to see George. So I suspect if you gave the minister enough money, they would open the casket. Then people wanted to touch George. And they started taking parts of his garb. And they were apparently a little rough on George because over the course of time, certain parts of him started disappearing. A femur here, a fibula there. But there was some power about this guy that people couldn't get enough of George, this grand itinerant. That's something great. Imagine the power of a religious figure to pull people like that. It's amazing. He had the savvy and the discipline to understand the culture and what it wanted at that time. And he gave it to the people. He was a kind of religious entrepreneur. And on one level, it worked, didn't it? Church attendance, which had dipped way down, soared. The estimates are that 1 out of every 3 Americans actually made the effort to go hear Whitefield. This is before television and transportation and all the modern technology. He connected. People made an effort, a conscious decision to hear the message. The attendance at New Light churches soared. They could get 20% of a town's population to become members in their church if they were the ones who sponsored Whitefield when he came through. That's pretty impressive to get 20% of a town. And think about how it brought religion back into the discussion of American life and culture, American thought. Europe didn't have some of these types of experiences, and over the course of time, religion and cultural life tended to drift apart. But because there were these moments of connection, religion stayed in the American mind in a way that it wouldn't outside of America. Did they change things? Yeah, they did. Were they right in doing so? I don't know. That's the dilemma, isn't it? Because we still have to ask ourselves, can the church be simultaneously faithful and relevant?